Last time you wanted to talk about what makes games fun. I want to dig right into that because I can't imagine anything better to talk about in terms of game development than what makes games fun. In all of the literature I read about game development, that seems to be the pinnacle question, the litmus test for any decision that can be made. Is this going to be fun? And it's also a question that has multiple answers. When you're in the middle of developing a game, it seems like fun until people try it and they say this is boring or it sucks or it interferes with the other things that I really want to do. And so it's hard to answer that question at different stages, but really there is the ultimate answer, which is the player saying, yep, this is fun, or finding a new way to answer this question. I don't like the fun that you've made up, so I'm going to create a new kind of fun, which is the emergent gameplay that we've talked about in previous episodes. So, Lammy, just for you, and this is totally in terms of your taste, what makes a game fun?
Well, my number one thing, and I think we've touched on this before, but I think my number one driver in life as a whole is curiosity. So I'd have to say that exploration and learning, like about the world in whatever way that is, that could be about the story, it could be mechanics, but especially the world itself. If it's, let's say, some sort of action game or game where you're moving about the world, I'd like to explore it. And for me, that's probably the number one thing that makes games fun. Now, I don't only play those kinds of open world or 3D games, so it's definitely more of a broad kind of brain connection thing that we talked about last time, right? So it's all about making new connections and new patterns and strengthening those connections that you just recently made in your brain and those neurons firing. Really, that's what makes games fun. And for me, that's learning something new, which is often experienced through solving a curiosity or knowing that there's now future curiosities out there to go explore and to solve. So, yeah, that's the simplest way I can put it. What about you?
Well, I can totally relate to curiosity. Like, that is my definition of a good life, is a curious life. I think it was Socrates or Plato that said, "A life unexamined is not a life worth living." Not just examination, but to explore, to wonder, to be bewildered by the stars, by the universe, by a game that you're playing, by a novel that you're reading. I mean, that's profound for me, and never ceases to make me interested, fascinated, and propelled to the next step. Um, but I wonder, before I'll answer your question, before I do, is there a point at which either the length of time overall that you play a game, or how much you play a game in a single session, or how much you've been looking into a particular thing within a game in one session, that you just become exhausted by learning about the world, about the lore, or about a particular curiosity?
Yeah, I think there's probably two sort of barriers and walls that I hit. There's usually a wall around 1 hour of play that, depending on the kind of game or how much fun I'm having with it, usually I don't play games for less than an hour very often. That's kind of like if I want to play a video game, and I think a lot of adults share this feeling that they feel like they don't have time because they would usually put in and set aside at least an hour of time. So usually there could be, let's say, a kind of wall of, okay, I'm done with whatever kind of strain I was putting in for this game. The real limit for me, though, usually comes around 3 hours. So 3 hours is usually a hard limit. That is very rarely do I get sucked into something enough that I don't feel too exhausted to keep going. I think especially if I'm learning lots of new things or getting mechanically invested, that's about where I really hit kind of a wall. And very, very rare, often creative crafting type games. Stardew Valley comes to mind, where it definitely kept me for like 5 or 6 hours at a time. Animal Crossing, I can play that literally all day, but you also just play it very chill. It's more of a sim game. So those simulation type creative games, I can definitely stick through a bit longer because I'm completing a task of some sort. But yeah, usually I would say 1 hour and then 3 hours. 3 hours, an absolute sort of exhaustion that will hit for a lot of games for me.
Yeah, I think it's similar for me. The problem is that there are two kinds of fun being had here. There's the fun in completing the task, and there's the fun in learning about the world. And absolutely, the task can keep me going for 12 hours. I can
Yep.
just do the next task and the next
Yeah.
task and just see how far I can get and exhaust myself. The the fun of learning about something, of digging into a character, of reading about the world or exploring the world, yeah, that's between 1 and 3 hours for me, and
Yeah.
sometimes even just 1 hour, where it's
Yeah.
like reading a book. After an
Mhm.
hour, okay, I've got to kind of digest what I've learned before I can return to it again. But the problem is, if both things are happening at the same time, then I will continue doing the tasks, continue building or organizing or completing things, and just say, oh, screw it, I don't want to learn about this right now, and just click through, click through, click through.
Right.
And then, of course, I regret it next session when I sit down to play, and I thought, well, I didn't learn anything about that, and I don't want to have to go back and just read books for 2 hours
Right.
or 8 hours or however long it is. And so the kind of perfect balance necessitates that I don't play a game which offers both kinds of fun for too long. A game like Stellaris, which is a grand strategy 4X game in space where you build your
Mhm.
empire over the scale of about 200 to 300 years. You are building all of these things, but intertwined with it is a procedurally generated story around your empire, how you relate to other empires, how you colonize planets, how you define different decrees, and it's vastly complex. But I can't tell you the last time that I played the game where I didn't just click through the what this anomaly is, or what this
Right.
story in this relic is about. I would love to do a playthrough like that, but I have to say my normal method of playing, which is to binge it for however many hours, I'd have to put that aside and do chunks at a time, which then means that the fun of doing the tasks I'm going to become less proficient at, because there's a rhythm that you get into with that. Yeah.
So yeah, I guess I'm so surprised to hear that you skip lore. That's like the opposite of what I would ever have guessed in talking to you so far. I think that's a major
It's a
character.
shame. It's a
Well,
guilty
guilty
pleasure.
shame. Yeah, I don't know. I would say that probably most people, my guess would be that most people are lore skippers, like the majority of gamers, and that there's a fewer number of gamers, less than 50%. I mean, it might be 40, it might not be that different, 40, 60 or something, but I do think it's one of those personality traits. Are you the kind of person that's going to sit there and read every lore tablet? What about, the optional lore? Like, are you going to go through the journals as they fill in and read everything, or just the things that you have to click on to pick up? Or, and I would have thought, especially lore, that you probably would read that. But
I
when it comes to mechanics, you choose the mechanics. You're like, I'm
Yeah,
going to choose
yeah.
the, yeah.
Well, I fall into it. Like I said, I will do both for an hour to 2 hours. I will definitely be comprehensive in both modes of fun. But if I'm less than that, then I'm less into the mechanics. But if I'm more than that time, I can't. I can't take it all in. It's like reading a book and just skipping. I never do this. I never read a book and skip pages. I know people who do, and I think that they should die in hell. It's just no.
What's
I'm
the
joking,
point?
but I don't. I
But
don't get
yeah,
it. How could you skip?
yeah.
Like I have an ex who said to me once that she just skipped over a paragraph if she thought it wasn't important. How do you know if it's
How do you
important or
know?
not if you haven't read the damn paragraph? And so I guess the same would be true for
Mhm.
games, but there's a signal that game designers send to you to say this is important and is in the
Yes.
story, and this is extra. This is
Side extra stuff for people who really care.
extracurricular in a
Yeah.
sense. Yeah. And they will send you the signal by, in an RPG, for example, putting it in your journal if
Hmm.
it's important. If it's
Yeah.
not, and so therefore there's no consequence in the world by just skipping through things in most games. There
Yes.
are some no journal games, or some games where you have to write your own journal,
Mhm.
which is a much different investment of cognitive capacity, right?
Yeah.
To kind of master your understanding of the world rather than have it do it automatically for you. But yeah, absolutely. Like I also feel sometimes as an adult with other things to do and unlimited time to play games that I'm not sure when I'm going to get through 180 hours of gameplay, core gameplay.
Yeah.
And if I'm going to read everything, what does that balloon it to? Like how many hundreds of hours if I'm just going to read on a screen
Hmm.
too, just read through things. And so there is a sense for me to just skip through it, get to the next beat in the story, get to the point where I have to make a decision, or go to the next encounter where I can have a fight, and see how powerful I am now at level 10.
Yeah.
Um, and that's currently how I feel in the playthrough I'm doing of Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous,
Hmm.
which I have very limited time, but when I get into it, I have to determine for myself what I'm enjoying and what I'm not, because if I try to be completionist, which is definitely a part of who I am, I will never finish. Not only
Yeah.
never finish, I'll never get to the good parts. I'll never really understand the meat and potatoes of this game. So um, I imagine it's a struggle for many players, but certainly it's a struggle for design. Like
Mhm.
how do you create a game that provides multiple types of fun in balance that doesn't penalize someone for focusing on one kind of fun over another?
Do you think that that speaks, though, to a failure in the game design? These games where you feel you have to skip the lore?
Yes and no. I think that okay, so let's use Pathfinder: Wrath of the Righteous as an example. It is a vast game. Um, I'm just at the beginning of chapter 3, and chapter 3 I think is like the wide torso of the game, where most of the stuff is going to happen. The prologue is done. Now we're in the thick of it, and we can stay in that for dozens and dozens of hours. I suspect, because the map has just opened to endless possibilities. But it's also endless in the possibilities for character creation, the different types of person you can become, the different paths you can choose, the different companions you can bring along with you, the different things that you can explore, the decisions that you can make that, change how the game unfolds. And so for a game that is so vast, and also you pick up a book in almost every room that tells you something more about the crusades that you're a part of, essentially. And you're going to read it right there in room. You're going to save it for later when you're at camp, or you're going to print it off and read it in bed because you just don't want to look at a screen anymore. Like, what's the plan? And for me, I I don't think of it as a failure to have all of this extra stuff, because it just creates the impression that I'm in a properly thought out world. I don't have to read the book for it to mean something to me while playing the game.
Mhm.
For me to know almost that I'm cushioned by endless lore, that I'm in the hands of writers and artists who have thought this through, and the proof is in the pudding, and the proof is right next to me. And even if I don't read through the proof, I know it's there. Um, so I think the vastness also gives me a sense that of possibility, and yeah, that I'm really immersed in it. It's part of the immersion too. But I would say that's the positive, the success of the design. The failure, of course, is any good art is economical. There's no such thing as a masterpiece that has wasted space or unnecessary bits. Like if
Mhm.
you think of a great painting or a great poem, not a single word or a single brushstroke is unnecessary, or a great piece of music. Not a single note shouldn't be there, or is embellishment, um, or just a piece of furniture to make the room a little bit brighter. So in that way, it's a failure as art, but in terms of entertainment, it succeeds. So maybe that's the distinction here. I don't know. Um, do you find in games where the lore is extracurricular that it's a failure for you, that it's not woven enough into the spine of the story?
I do, and I think I don't even stick with those games for the most part, because I am a completionist. I do want to engage with, if I like a game, I want to engage with all parts of it, right? Like if I like a game, I do want to, especially when it comes, because again, I said my number one fun is exploration, is learning. So, let me walk that back a little and say, let's say there's games where you have multiple ways to approach conflict, right? So we're talking, um, oh my god, what's the game where there's like a nuclear war and you start Fallout? I think that's what
Fallout?
I'm thinking of, right? Where you can play the entire game non like combat. You can just talk your way
Yeah, I
through
think I
everything.
think Fallout, one of maybe the first one, is that.
There
Yeah.
you go. Yeah. So thinking of Fallout, where you can choose, because if you're not interested in sort of combat or shooting or anything, and you can still choose to go through the entire game in a totally different way, I think that's fine. And I will make those kinds of choices when they're presented to me, to not play a game in a way that doesn't align with what I find fun. But that's usually an option that was given within the game. And I am likely to, especially when it comes to reading things or engaging and completing of types of things, want to engage with content. And if the lore does just feel like every single room has a book, to me that's a bit of a failure, because I think, there's no way this is good anymore. Like, in that art sense that you spoke about, what are the chances that it's quality and quantity, right? Like, you have quantity, I do think sometimes an editing eye is necessary, and I think I'm more willing than most to read lore and to sit there and read. You know, I really liked Disco Elysium. I do tend to read lore, but I think there's a bit of how it's presented. Obviously, we know like really long single paragraphs or lots of pages in one at one time can be overwhelming, and people are way more likely to skip it rather than just, even if you're providing the same total amount but in smaller chunks throughout, which I think can be a good way to get people in. But it also matters where it's presented. Is this an action game where for some reason now you have a book that interrupts the action and you have to read it? Like that doesn't fit, right? Or is the lore coming in and is actually woven and intermingled into the way the game is played and what the game feeling is actually about? And not to bring up my probably one of my favorite games of all time, Outer Wilds, again, but the way that they do lore and the way that text is handled in that game is, I mean, it's both what the game is about, but is also still a game, an action game where you're moving around with mouse and keyboard, and yet the reading is completely seamlessly intertwined. You know, because disco feels more like you're reading a book.
Mm-hmm.
Play disco, and it's part of the premise, and it's fine. It makes sense. It's a different kind of game altogether. But you can even do lore, I think, in more action games and in other kinds of play styles, and still make it seamless. And I do think that there is a bit on the game devs when they just go, okay, well, there's some people who are lore heads, and we're just going to give them a bunch of like books to read, but the people who don't like, you know, don't like that won't even interact with it at all. Like it's a bit weird. Like maybe
Yeah,
there's a
it's
better way.
it's discombobulated, right? They're just saying, let's have this and let's have this and let's have this, rather than find a way to merge them together. And I think Disco Elysium is a great example of a game where I think there's different types of fun to be had in that game. There's different things that are enjoyable. There's a sense of humor, there's the lore, there's the reading, there's making decisions, there's enjoying being a disaster and being liberated from making the good decisions, and knowing that making bad decisions are just as good as the quote unquote good ones,
Mhm.
and lead to interesting, not just interesting scenarios, but lead to interesting outcomes.
Yes.
Whereas in a classic RPG, there is a the best path through the game usually, and
They literally
designers
go
try.
green, red,
Yeah,
good, evil. It's like,
that's
come
right,
on.
and you can go down the bad path, and when I say bad, I don't necessarily mean evil. I just mean
Yeah.
the mistaken path. You
Yes.
can go down the failed path, which will bring you back to the success path.
Mhm.
Whereas in Disco, the success path is probably the one with the dead end.
Right.
The failure path is the one
Mhm.
that is going to take you places, which is so interesting in terms of the design. But I would say that if you don't enjoy reading it through and understanding what's going on and kind of joining the rhythm of the game, you're not really enjoying anything. I
Mhm.
can't imagine that anyone is going to skip through that game, skipping through the dialogue and the lore, and get anywhere,
Mhm.
because that's it. That's the substance, and yet there's so much encapsulated in it. But just for a moment, to play devil's advocate, just because it's on my mind, we mentioned masterpieces of art, paintings, poetry,
Mhm.
literature, music, whatever. If we think of a classical piece of painting from, say, the 18th century, there are things in those paintings that were were put in there for a specific audience of aristocrats who understood and had read things, who had been to school, that you and I don't understand, that most art historians today are hard pressed to go, what does that mean again? What is the symbolism of an orange and a clock next to a skull? There's a whole level of enjoyment in classical music, too, is another example. There's a whole level of enjoyment for people who really understand this stuff. And then there's another level of enjoyment for those of us who, yeah, we like it, but we don't know the history of it, the context.
Mhm.
Is that because the composer or painter created different things for different people, or is there a core? And I would argue, maybe to answer my own devil's advocate point, that in a masterpiece, that the thing that is for everyone is there no matter what. That it's
Mhm.
a core premise of it. But different people can get different things from art, and I think the same would be true for a game like Pathfinder, where surely the designers just said to themselves, look, it doesn't matter if some players don't read these books. Some players will. And
Yes.
their experience is just as valuable as the one who just wants to fight, who
Mhm.
just wants, is there an item in here? No. Is there a level up,
Mhm.
or is there experience to be had in here? No. Okay, get me to the fight. Both are valuable. And maybe what games offer that a painting doesn't is a vastly different experience for different people. And I wonder, without saying Disco Elysium is better or worse than than Pathfinder, for example, I wonder if this is a new kind of art, or if the old Aristotelian perspective is true, that there is a core, there is a main thrust.
So coming back to fun, my opinion on it is that Pathfinder obviously is still fun for certain people and is still probably considered a good game by lots of people. But we're comparing things here. You know, we're talking, I think, even though we say what makes games fun, there's an implied what's the most fun, right? What's the best way?
Yes.
And I think that's where I would say that when it comes to works of art, when it comes to those special games, they're unmistakable. You know, we talk art is subjective, obviously, but you can't deny that there are certain kind of almost global truths, that there are pieces of art that are almost universally loved. And I think it's the same for games. There are special games that almost everyone enjoys, even people who wouldn't necessarily like that style of game normally, that there is something about them. They're the ones that break the mold a little, right? They're the ones that kind of combine genres or blur the lines, or they do something new, and they're not just a game anymore. They're not just a entertainment source, as we were discussing about what a game is. They're no longer just entertainment because they've crossed the line a little bit into being something, an experience, like a really valuable experience that we look at it as the way people do with books that they go, you know, you need to read this because it's going to change your life. Like in some subtle way, in the smallest way, you are going to have a moment that is important, that, you know, your life, people who love something will go, you know, you'll have that moment that you will feel like, okay, my life is a little better as a whole just because I've experienced this thing. And that's like the epitome, I think, that the games that are so, either whether it's fun or, you know, we can talk maybe next time around games that aren't fun but are still very valuable.
Is there a base level you have to be at, though, to get this universal truth? And I'm thinking about my wife, for example, who has spent like practically 0 minutes in her life playing video games, like board games, absolutely all the time. But video games, I honestly don't know if she spent more than a couple hours playing video games. I think when she was in university, she had a roommate that played games, and she might have picked up a console controller once in a while. I think that's it.
Mm-hmm.
When she comes to a game that you and I value
Mm-hmm.
as not just really fun, but as a work of art that is going to move you and change you,
Mm-hmm.
it's going to take her a long time to get there. I think. I might be wrong. This might be an interesting experiment. But does that is that an exception to the point? Does that prove the point by being an exception, or is that just the ticket of entry?
I think you're totally right. And I think it's true of lots of other kinds of art that we've discussed. So let's take reading, for example. And reading is something that we know that people who don't read a lot and haven't learned about the joy of reading for whatever reason in their lives, it doesn't matter if you tell them this is the best book they're ever going to read, they're going to struggle because they struggle with the innate skill of reading, right? If it's difficult for them and it's a lot of effort, I know that reading is effort for me now. We talked about, you know, people don't read maybe as much as they were reading when they were younger, and it's definitely physically just harder for me because I haven't worked on that skill. And video games are a skill as well. They have their own language, their own vocabulary, their own in kind of knowledge that unless you're a part of, obviously you're not going to understand as well. So no, 100%. I think you're right that there is, and coming back to what you were saying earlier about the pieces of art that had specific context and specific things that don't make sense to us so much anymore, and people have to study, art historians have to study for a long time to understand the context. I think there's obviously much more enjoyment when you fully understand something than when you don't. The only thing I'd say is that I think that those special cases are still more likely to impress the non-initiated than maybe, now they might be harder, right? So take a really easy book to read, let's say Harry Potter. Just some sort of whatever book you might consider fun and fluff and easy, right? Anybody could pick it up and be like, yes, I understand why this is enjoyable. Like, I get it. You might have a much more important, heavy, deep, mind-blowing book, but it might just be too difficult for somebody to want to get into. And that could be true with games as well. There's a wonderful series by a YouTuber called Rasputin. He does gaming for a non-gamer. And he actually did kind of, I think, the experiment you were thinking of, where he got his wife to play different types of games and just watched her struggle, because she didn't, this exact thing of like, they don't have terminology. They don't know how to move with mouse and keyboard. They don't know, like, and didn't help her. Like, essentially just watched her struggle and tried his best not to even, just to see how are games already speaking in a way that for a beginner, without any of the prior knowledge, without growing up with it, they really would be lost, right? What can tutorials do? What can games do to bring in people who haven't gamed a lot in the past? And I think that's part of what makes a game fun as well, is bridging the gap of being very intuitive, right? Getting their point across. Like, any piece of art, I think, is doing a good job if it's very obvious what they're trying to say. Not in like beating you over the head kind of way, but in a, like, it shouldn't be obtuse, right? I think obtuse is a negative term for a reason.
Yeah, but I think as any artist, there's an assumption of the tools that the participant comes with.
Yes.
For literature, it's obviously a level of literacy in addition to an understanding of how a novel is usually written, unless it's a more basic kind of book like Harry Potter. But even then, we're all when it comes to story, I think there's something about story that is deeply within us that we don't really have to work at. We almost are born with an inherent understanding of story. It's because it's how we identify ourselves. It's how we define our lives already. But when we come to look at a painting, there's an understanding of, usually, of the context of what things mean, or why things are positioned in a certain way, or where to put your eyes and the lines of focus. There are tools that you come in with, but there's almost like a graph that you could draw. The more complicated the tools you expect people to have, the fewer people are going to play your game, look at your piece of art, whatever. And I think that's an interesting question. And it's not just that we should always aim for the widest berth of that graph, because an example would be Disco Elysium, which is a fairly simple game to play in terms of what you're clicking on, but in terms of how you use your brain in it, it's quite complicated. It's, there's a lot of different skills, and there's, again, you have to come with almost a literate sensibility to that game as well. But you mentioned something else which I found interesting, which is, I think is very true. You said games that are seen to be really great works of art also broke the mold, also it took a risk when they came out, pushed against something. I think the same is true with art. Think of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, which people rioted. They rioted when they first saw it or heard it. Like, what? You went to a piece of music and you rioted? I mean, this was in Paris, so that's part of the answer there. But, I think games do the same thing, and any kind of art is always pushing against something, is always reacting to something that came before. We don't have to have played the reaction to play we don't have to have played the thing that it's reacting to enjoy the reaction for what it is. I remember watching Saturday Night Live when I was a kid, seeing people do impressions of people I didn't know and never heard of, and still found them hilarious. And people would say to me, do you even know who he's making fun of? No, but it's hilarious. I don't need to know the target to enjoy the activity. Yeah.
Right. It's true. And that thought came to me, especially when you were talking about games, because there's been a host of games in the past 5 years, maybe even more, where a lot of the thematics of them were how they were breaking the mold of video gaming, and this kind of satire and commentary that they were making on games themselves, right? There's a bunch of these. I don't know if you've played many, like obviously Undertale is the main example. I think even like Stanley Parable and even Outer Wilds in some ways, that they play with your expectation of what a game should be, or they're trying to say something about gaming as a whole. They're not just breaking the mold in a normal way, but they're actually using what they expect a gamer knows against them, right? To subvert their expectations.
Right.
and to make the person playing the game actually think, oh wait, why am I relying on past experience so much to play a game? Like, is that actually the right thing to do? Is the way I normally play games good or not? A lot of these kind of big questions, and that somebody who doesn't know those tropes, like doesn't understand that, wouldn't play a game that way anyway, or just doesn't know that that's a trope, misses all that, goes over their head. It's just something that they don't even get, that there's this other undertone that the game is trying to get at, but they might still enjoy it. Like you said, they don't know who the impression is about, but there's still something fun. I feel like we're talking about what makes a game fun. You still have to have something fun there. If you're trying to appeal, if you're saying, okay, I do want to appeal more to just than a very, very narrow set of people.
I wonder if this is a function in part of an art form becoming mature over time, right? Like I wonder if you were to actually be an art historian and go back and really understand the emergence of music, the emergence of a particular kind of music, the emergence of poetry, the emergence of the novel, and to ask, in the beginnings of these things, in the early days of an art form, was it art or was it almost pure entertainment?
Yeah.
Was it just pure
Or
enjoyment and yeah,
information, or I'm thinking about writing and reading. Some of it was just,
sure.
utilitarian.
Well,
Forget
yeah, I mean,
entertainment. It might just
that's it.
be necessary.
Writing, that's a great example. The earliest writing was probably accounting. It
Yeah.
was probably just counting the number of bushels of wheat you had in the granary. Um, but then, of course, there are cave paintings that predated that, which were potentially about accounting for how many animals you killed that day. But there is this understanding of at an early stage, does an art form do something different than what it does when it matures? And are we seeing games today maturing into something where you're always going to have the entertainment? You're always going to have, for example, the popcorn Marvel movie, but sometimes the popcorn Marvel movie, steps over into something deeper once in a
Right.
while. And it couldn't have done that in the early days of cinema. In the early days of cinema, there were very few types of movies, in part because there were very few types of audiences, very few tools that we as an audience came to watch a movie with. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was playing devil's advocate in my own head about that, because also in many ways, the more mature a form of media is, the trashier it gets, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's you're just, more of it's being made, right? The
Yeah.
longer it's been around, it's just, yeah.
Yeah. It's just the circle is growing. There's more to fit
Mhm,
into it. And of course, at the core of it, you're going to have more art. And at
mhm.
the edges, you're going to have more trash. Yeah.
Yeah, or, it's just, so it's tough to say. I think it's really about, it's actually almost less about the consumption of it in a way, and also who's excited to create the art, and what's the curiosity and you know ways that we want to express. I guess that maybe a fundamental feeling that I have, and it's weird, I can't quite bring myself to fully say this, but I think that, and maybe it's just, again, the way that I am, that I kind of am a little bit of a jack of all trades, and I do like a little bit of anything, and I feel like I can get excited and interested in anything that somebody else finds exciting and interesting, because if somebody finds something really, really interesting, I trust that there's a reason why, right? It might not be really my thing, but seeing somebody be passionate about something and really get into it, you know there's a reason why. And I think you can always see a nugget of that. And my point is that I think that at the end of the day, any piece of art or game or something that is found to be amazing, even if you're not the target audience, I kind of feel like if you just allowed yourself, if you just put yourself into the shoes of what they were trying to do, if you just went with it, if you didn't fight against it and go, well, I don't like puzzle games, or I don't like reading games, or that you would actually at least see a small part of what made it amazing, rather than, oh, well, no, they just don't have the tools, so they're not. Like, it's true, I think they can very easily fight against it, but that there's a fundamental part of me that believes, like, no, just try to like the thing. Why are you trying not to like the thing? Why are you trying to say that you're not the kind of person who could enjoy that kind of thing? If the thing is truly amazing. This is where the pretentious part comes out, because I'm like, well, you don't need to try to like Twilight if you don't want to read vampire, like
Right, right.
erotica. There's no point to like Twilight. But sometimes a piece of art is good enough that even if it's not in your preferred genre, or I feel like it's worth giving a try.
I totally agree with you. And I live my life that way because I think we're both curious people and we live our lives based on curiosity. So we know that when we pursue something that is on the other side of a wall, we're going to be better off in the end. We're going to enjoy it more. We're going to be bigger, better people. We're going to live the bigger life. Not everyone wants that, and not everyone is capable for that. And so, to play devil's advocate to your devil's advocate, probably to my devil's advocate, um, if I think about my time as an adult, I've got a lot of different things to do. I can go home and play with my kid. I've got books to read. I've got projects on the go. I've got work to be done, money to be made, whatever, right? I've got this to work on. Do I really want to spend hours watching Getting into Twilight? I know that if I did, I would find something in it. It would just be a path that I'm choosing. But if I were to take a step back, I can go down the Twilight path, or I can go down and read Charles Dickens. Probably in between the two of those right now. I've read Charles Dickens, might read Twilight just because it's a little easier, or I assume it's a little easier. But anyways, there's this dance we have to play as adults, which is, how much time do I have and what choices will I make accordingly? Like, my wife is probably, if I were to say, hey, let's play a ton of games so that I can see what a non-gamer enjoys in them and doesn't, she'd say, I've got other things to do, Ben. Like, I don't have all the time in the world. And so, this is the balance, I think, with games too, because there are so many games out there. Not all of them are great, but all of them might be worth trying. All of them might have some seed of information, some lesson that we can glean from them. So, yeah, this is the conversation, Lammy, that I have in my head all the time. So it's nice to have it with someone else about the value of what's on the other side, right? And what fun can be had in something that you don't think is fun, or don't have the tools to make fun, or whatever. So,
do you find that if something surprises you, is something more fun because you didn't expect it to be fun and then it was?
Yes, but then I would say there are different kinds of fun, aren't there? Right. So when I'm truly surprised by something, there's almost a fun, a giddiness of, oh, that's interesting. That subverted my expectations, which is different from the more gluttonous kind of fun that I get when I eat the same bag of chips I've eaten for my entire life and eat it one more time. It's still fun. Or watch that same movie over and over again. Or, to go back to games, have another encounter in a game I played hours in and had many encounters, maybe on the 7th playthrough of the same encounter. It's fun, but there are different kinds. And I would say, obviously, the unexpected kind of fun is wonderful, but I would also get exhausted by that quite quickly.
And
Like,
that's
that's
where we
something I need to take
started.
a break from. Yeah, right?
That's where we started. And I think that for me, if I were to judge against each other, I do think that unexpected, that new, that special kind of fun, rather than the one you're used to or the easier to consume, is better, right? I mean, if I had to say, but that doesn't
Qualitatively, yeah.
mean, that we have to always be doing the things that are better for us at all times, and that there's a necessity for enjoying art and medium that is easy to consume. But I also think that, like with reading, the more we consume difficult things, the easier it becomes. And we get that joy, and it's not as exhausting. It really is a muscle, right? Your own brain as to learn, it becomes easier the more you do it. And especially as we get into adulthood, where we're not learning anywhere near as often as we were as children, it does become harder. And that I take it really to heart about going and experiencing a new game that might really break the mold. In fact, because it's a game, this is a really interesting thing, much easier than if it were another kind of medium. I'm way more likely to play a game that might be really deep and heavy and difficult and like just hard on my brain than I am to read a book or even watch a movie that would do the same, which is really interesting about where we place certain medium in our lives and what we use them for, like what kind of entertainment we use them for, I actually think I'm more likely to devote time to a game that is difficult than I am to devote time to, for sure, for me, a TV show that is difficult. I tend to like watching, really, really great movies, and I like watching great TV shows too, but I'm okay with watching slightly mediocre TV shows because I can kind of not pay as much attention to them. They're just a thing,
Right.
and sometimes I'll want to read a book and I'll be like, I just don't have the time to devote to like this really deep, difficult book. But a game, I think because it's supposed to be innately fun, innately entertaining. Like, oh, just do it. Just go play the game. It's going to be a good time. It's a game. And they tricked me.
Yeah, I would say I would imagine that part of this is the muscles that you've developed for yourself too, right? So you and I were playing Valheim the other night, which is an exploration game, wonderful. But I was really frustrated for the first while playing it. It was hard because I'm not used to using like I'm just not used to playing those kinds of games, right? Where you have to be quite not just tactical with how you move your guy around, but quite fast. Like it's not slowing down for you. There's no turn-based pause system where you can say, okay, how am I going to use my skills on this? You just have to run away and punch the guy. And if you're not fast enough, you die. And I'm just not, I don't have the hand-eye coordination from years of playing those kinds of games. And many people don't, and they don't play the same kinds of games either. But it was hard for me. And I would certainly say that I would probably watch a hard movie first before doing that. But on the other side of it, I did come out after about an hour and a half going, okay, I can relax, I can enjoy this, I can go collect some wood, punch a tree, and there was I found that luckily, but it took me I had to get over a hill, and the hill was technical and skill based, which I'm sure that some gamers who are more used to playing games like Assassin's Creed, any game really on a console probably, which I don't ever play, would probably go to that and find it kind of a walk in the park. I imagine. I might be wrong, but there's other elements of the game like the economy system and the resource system that I probably find easier or closer to. Yeah, so we're getting to the end. I could talk about this for a long time. And before we get exhausted and start skipping over things because we're too tired, let's come to the end, and then we can revisit this stuff in a future episode. But as usual, I've got my last question for you. So I hope you've been thinking about it. Other than this, what do you want to talk about more? So in the next session, in our next episode, what do you want to dig into?
So today we talked about what makes games fun, a little bit, sort of. And I would like to talk about, do games need to be fun at all?
Okay.
Is that something they need to be valuable?
Is there a game you've played that was not fun but valuable for you?
Okay. I technically didn't play it myself, so it's a bit of a cheater answer. Because I didn't know the kind of game that it was. But Doki Doki Literature Club is a game that I don't think that I would find fun. But having seen somebody play through it, which is essentially playing through it yourself for the kind of game that it is, and for anybody out there who knows the game, I think it's very valuable.
Okay.
And even it's hard because often there's aspects of the game that are fun, but it's not the value of the game isn't that it's fun. It's the other stuff. Even a game like Limbo, which is a puzzle platformer, and I like puzzle platformers, but it's creepy, it's dark, it's hard. I guess, yeah, I'd have to think maybe I'll have a better answer for you at the beginning of the next session.
That's a great answer. If you could, before our next episode, play Doki Doki Literature Club.
Well, there's nothing to play now because I've already seen the whole, it's a story game as well. I already know how it goes. But
and it's not something you could just play for a bit to get the experience out of it?
I've essentially gotten the experience out of it. Now you, however, should go play the game. It is free. It is a free game on Steam. So
okay, yeah. I'll tell you how. And next time we talk, I'll tell you how little fun I have.
Yeah,
but how much value there was.
It's not a long game. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. All right. Well, thanks again, and I'm excited for the next chat about Doki Doki Literature Club. Is that right?
Yes, it is right.
And if games don't have to be fun.
Yeah.
Okay. Talk to you next time.
talk to you next time.